Salam alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now on Thursday last week, CAGE, an organisation established to promote and protect human rights in the wake of the detentions and torture in Guantanamo Bay, held a press conference to coincide with the revealing of the identity of the so-called Jihadi John, the notorious masked figure who appeared in videos showing the beheading of several hostages in 2014 and 2015. Now, the conference used the opportunity to highlight what they saw as the abuses of the security services and the likelihood that harassment and intimidation by them may well have led to individuals such as Mohammed Emwazi to become a man of violence. I'm pleased to be joined in our studio today by the Regional Director of CAGE, Asim Qureshi. Asim, salam alaikum and welcome to Islam Channel.
Thank you.
Now, a Guardian Home Affairs columnist wrote this week, it's rare for a small campaign group to gain worldwide attention. On Thursday, CAGE, formerly CAGE prisoners, achieved that. It has been suggested that in excess of 800 million people had access to the live programming that was broadcast for nearly an hour on Sky TV, BBC News, CNN, and interviews and features managed to dominate the top of the news story on flagship news programmes such as Today programme, Newsnight, and so on. In hindsight, was it wise to hold the press conference at this time? Admittedly, David Cameron subsequently announced an investigation into the role played by MI6 in the treatment of Michael Advocacy, and there can be no doubt that you got the world's attention. But is the outcome what you hoped for?
Well, Carl, I think what we need to look at is the fact that this was the Washington Post story. They were going to release the name Mohammed Emwazi anyway. So what we were given was the opportunity to be able to contribute to that piece by giving them some information that we knew about an experience this young man had while he was in the UK. So the piece was going to come out regardless. What we did was that we took that opportunity in order to say, okay, we know that there is an end product that is now known as Jihadi John, who's going around committing these brutal executions. But there's a period in the UK, a period of time that I knew him because he was a client of mine, where he didn't seem to display any of those sentiments. In fact, if anything, I remember him being very kind and very gentle. So what I wanted to know, and the question that we were posing to the British public, and especially to the security establishment, is what happened in this period in the UK? And the evidence that we have, which was an interview that I conducted with Mohammed back in 2009, and then almost 3 years of email communications with him, where he's complaining to me about harassment that he's facing by the security agencies. Now, we're not saying that all of that directly resulted in him going around doing beheadings and executions, but what we're saying is that we as a society have to learn lessons when these horrible things happen. So part of learning those lessons is that we have to understand this period in the UK. What was it about that period that made Mohammed Emwazi feel like he didn't belong as part of British society?
We've had this question being asked for other people for now many years since the war on terror began, the question of how somebody becomes, to use the official term, radicalised. But before we get into more detail on that, can you tell me, I mean, it was sort of posted that you'd been in collaboration with the Washington Post, and that crucial to their breaking the story was the information that you provided. To what degree were you collaborating with Washington Post?
No, I mean, this is their, once again, as I said already, this was their story. They were going to release this name, whatever happened anyway, because they had received independent verification. Adam Goldman has actually been quite out there tweeting this fact that, you know, we had already received verification of Mohammed Emwazi's identity. It's only because I knew the journalist Suad Mekhanet previously from working on other stories with her. She knows that I've got my finger on the pulse here in London in relation to the Muslim community. She said, look, you know, I've got a name. Do you know anything about this guy named Mohammed Emwazi? This was 2 Saturdays ago. And we said, look, we need to check our files, but we also have to confirm with the family if they're willing for us to share information about this name that you've given. So we went away, we did both those things, we got confirmation from the family, and then we came back to Suad Mekhanet, and we said to her that, okay, yes, we've actually kind of, you know, we've got some files on him, you know, some interesting stuff about harassment that he faced, you know, while he was a client of ours. This was up until January 2012. So then the next day, then Suad Mekhanek comes back to us with a laptop, you know, and shows us a video of one of the executions. It's actually the first time.
So up until that point, you weren't aware they were referring to Jihadi John?
No, it was only on the Sunday that she then says, look, I want you to watch a video, and I want you to tell me whether or not you think that this guy is the same as Mohammed Emwazi. And I said, look, there are some striking similarities between the two. I can't deny that. But he's got a hood over his head. It's impossible for me to actually say for certain that the two men are the same. But yeah, you know, I've got to say that there definitely seems to be some similarity.
Now, as the Guardian columnist wrote in his piece, in 2010, when Mohammed Emwazi, now revealed as the man dubbed Jihadi John, needed someone to listen to his claims of harassment by the British authorities, he went to Cage, he wrote. It's also true that Cage had also been in contact with other troubled figures, including Michael Adebolajo, the man who hacked Lee Rigby to death in the streets in London in May 2013, in which you argued, like Emwazi, had been harassed by the security services prior to his violent action. Is it the case that the collective case studies of intimidation and harassment that you've been dealing with at Cage, or as you put it, the realization, and I'm going to quote you, that Britain had created an environment where the security agencies can destroy the lives of young people without any recourse, did that provide the compelling need for you to go public last week on this issue of the pathway to radicalisation?
Yeah, I think these are important questions. I think our security agencies have to be held to account because every single day we have young men, women, and even some very young people going through airports and being questioned about their views about Islam, about their politics, and often those interviews lead to further intimidation and harassment. Now, it's one thing for the police to ask about you in terms of, you know, if they've got an investigation and they want to know if you know anything about that investigation, then they can kind of contact you. You can go have a solicitor present. You can talk to them. You can tell them what you know. It's a completely different thing when you're trying to base assumptions about a community around what that community believes in, and then to then go into that community and spread fear and intimidate them into working for you, then this is a completely different matter.
And are you trying to suggest, because I'm trying to get an idea about the level of intimidation. There are many people who've asked over the last week and a half as to the sense of your allegation that somehow the intensity of the security services harassment is enough to send somebody off to start beheading people. What are the levels? Are you saying it's simply spreading fear is enough?
Let's be clear. Okay, we're talking about every single case individually. In the case of Michael Adebolajo, what I believe pushed him over the edge was the security agencies, MI6, going to his brother in Saudi Arabia and saying things like, if you don't cooperate with us, then basically, you know, we're going to remove our protection from you, and, you know, maybe the Saudi authorities will arrest you and pick you up. I had their Christian sister Blessing in my office crying her eyes out because the brother Jeremiah in Saudi Arabia had gone missing for a 24-hour period. He'd gone on a holiday, but without telling anybody. And she's crying in her office because she says, I believe that they've actually carried out their threat. So it's in this environment that Michael Adebolajo, that his sister are panic-stricken. Okay, this is coupled with the other harassment that Michael already faced, his detention and abuse in Kenya, and so on and so forth. So all of that culminates. I'm not saying there's a single factor, and I'm not even saying that those should necessarily lead somebody to violence. What I'm saying is that if we don't look at these factors in a genuine and honest way, then quite frankly, we're totally missing the point. We have to look at them in culmination with other factors as well.
Many people have argued that or questioned your ultimate motives in having this press conference. It's just that you're an apologist for terrorism. So perhaps you can clear this up for us today. What are your true motives? I know you've tried to explain that you want to get a challenge to the narrative which you think is wrong. But are you interested in protecting the lives of what you see as these young Muslims who are being harassed by the security services? Are you trying to stop the perpetration of horrendous acts on the streets of London and Britain, or internationally, people being beheaded, or do you have some other sinister agenda?
Look, Carl, our position is very, very clear, and this is what we've been working on from the very day we started, which is we want due process, we want accountability, we want to stop extrajudicial killings, torture, arbitrary detention, no matter who perpetrates it. Whether it's Jihadi John or George Bush, it doesn't make a difference to us, because as Muslims, we're against this from our religion, okay? But also, you know, if we want a more stable society, we have to work towards these things. We've had 13 years of the war on terror, 13 years of counter-terrorism policies around the world. The world is significantly more dangerous than it was when 9/11 happened. And we have to ask ourselves why. Because they said we need all of these different counter-terrorism policies in order to defeat Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's mentality and so on and so forth. I haven't seen the results of that. I haven't seen any results of that. In fact, all I've seen is things get, you know, progressively worse. And so what we're saying is that we have to arrest that narrative somehow. And the way that we do that is by pushing for more rights, more transparency, more accountability. When somebody commits an offense, a war crime in Iraq, they should be held accountable for it, whether they're an American soldier or whether they're an ISIS soldier.
Now, the Daily Mail ran a headline after your press conference which read, "Nauseating and odious press conference, apologists for terror and the do-gooders that fund them." The accompanying article read that, and I'm going to quote them, "Rather than express an apology or even a smidgen of regret for having failed to turn Emwazi away from the path to barbarism, what we witnessed was almost an hour of excuses, accusations and invective against Britain, British society and British state. Are you reluctant to condemn in unequivocal terms the actions of those that commit such heinous crimes? Do you hold Emwazi, as has been asked repeatedly, responsible for his actions?"
Of course, we hold anybody who's committed a crime responsible.
Not anybody. Just tell me.
Yes,
do you hold Emwazi responsible?
I mean, one thing, everybody has to have a fair trial, Carl. So when he's brought before a court and evidence is produced against him and it's found that he's guilty of those, then of course, absolutely. As a generality, we can say if it's him that's conducting these executions, then yes, he should be held accountable for those. You know, recently, not too long ago, there was a war crimes tribunal in Malaysia where even some of my colleagues and friends, they were involved in giving evidence against George Bush and Dick Cheney, and they had a whole court. I was one of a few voices who actually said, this is wrong. You can't try people in absentia. You know, if you want to hold George Bush accountable for his crimes, then what you do is you bring him before a court, you have all your witnesses, the same witnesses you had on that day, and you try him properly. But we don't believe in this standard. As Muslims, we don't believe in this standard.
How do you account for the Prime Minister referring to what you have been saying as reprehensible? For the Home Secretary to have said yesterday in Parliament, I'm going to quote her, "As regards the comments made by Cage, I have to say to my honourable friend and to this House that there can be no excuse for the behaviour that has been shown by those who are operating in the name of ISIL, and I condemn anybody who attempts to excuse that barbarism in a way that has been done by Cage." I have to say one senior journalist spoke to me yesterday. He said attempts have been made, I know, to try and shut down Cage for speaking out by the back door. I mean, he's talking about the attempts to shut your bank accounts down and so on, and to impact on your funders. But he said that the tone and the timing of your press conference may well have given them the ammunition that they need to shut you down legally. Are you concerned that you will be now closed down, especially under the new legislation? And why do you think that senior government officials have taken this interpretation of your presentation?
Well, I think, you know, the alternative is that they have to be introspective. You know, of course, we're coming out with some very serious allegations here, and their natural instinct is to defend the security agencies that they fund, that they are politically and ideologically tied to. But what we're asking for is something very, very, you know, kind of sensible, and it's not asking for too much, I should imagine, to just ask some questions, to have an inquiry, to look into the allegations that are being made. Nobody said for a second that we should whitewash what ISIS do. Of course not. But if we want a more socially cohesive Muslim community in the UK, we have to learn the lessons where people have ended up in situations where we don't want them to end up.
I suppose what I'm saying, as if I may, is that in the context of the harsh images that the world watched on its screens over the last few months, and the situation of families who are of the victims, don't you think you possibly could have said a bit more in condemnation, especially given that you had an hour press conference on it?
We started our entire press conference in condemnation. You know, we condemned many, many different groups, individuals, including ISIS. We included them in that. You know, that's an extremely important point to remember. You know, this isn't something very light for us. You know, we feel very sore about what happened to Alan Henning in particular because we were heavily involved in trying to secure his release. We were making efforts, even when we weren't asked to by anybody, in order to try and do that. Our colleague, Moazem Beg, was making efforts for Alan Henning before the media even knew he existed. So this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about a group here who, you know, are trying to politically point score. We hurt a great deal when Alan died because it was the day, I think it was the day or 2 days after Moazem Beg was released, a very bittersweet moment in our history. So this isn't about kind of the, you know, the kind of politics of any of this stuff. We're talking about human lives here, and you can never.
And I suppose the same goes for all the other hostages.
Absolutely, absolutely. For all of the other hostages, we don't accept that extrajudicial killing is a way that people should be tried. We don't accept that that's a standard by which, you know, people should be killed, especially on TV like that. You know, these are people's lives at stake. Right from the very, very beginning of the war on terror with Guantanamo, we said about Guantanamo that there will come a time when, and I wrote this even in my own master's dissertation, that there will come a time when Western hostages, Western prisoners will require the Geneva Conventions. They will require them. And at that moment, we hope that we would have come back from the path that we're on with Guantanamo. But unfortunately, we didn't. And it's tragic, it's beyond tragic, that the same acts that were carried out in black sites, like waterboarding, the same orange jumpsuits, that visceral imagery was used by ISIS, was appropriated by ISIS in order to carry out these executions. That's why we say we need to stop both sides at the same time. We can't stop ISIS unless we look introspectively at ourselves and say, okay, where are the mistakes that we've made? How can we draw back from those mistakes? How can we put more emphasis on rights so that we set a standard in the Western world for behavior? That's the point.